Hello everyone, today we talk about the Huns. As I realized that I never really introduced them as relevant people, definitely in late antiquity, in the migration era, whichever side you prefer to stress. And although I have made videos actually about the role of the Huns in the aforementioned topics, which has inexplicably, as most old bad videos, had a lot of algorithmic, uh, let's say, fuel. Let's put it in this way. I thought to give it a try about the Huns. This video is relatively strange because I think I will title it something like on Hunnic identity or something like that, which is not specifically about the Hunnic origins, nor about Hunnic history per se, but realizing some aspect of their background that can be useful also to scope for a methodological purpose. That is to say, showing how historiography fundamentally has not solved much of the riddle posed by these people. That in part is also really a non-problem per se, because we will see it now, that the fact we can't really define who the Huns were in many ways, does it really matter to some point where we could talk about the Huns and how they have been perceived in Western culture and identity as many other peoples that left or didn't leave actually much of a trace also in the European continent, but surely echoed historiographically like the Huns up to becoming sort of archetype of savagery and kind of violence, etc. But otherwise, being definitely, these were definitely, say, people not particularly sensitive to humanity per se, but in many ways the world at the time was different. And yes, the Huns were wilder and more primitive than other populations, especially the sedentary ones, but still they represent in the broader movement waves, let's say, that pushed westwards in this case, but also eastward at some point, as you know, and the Huns perhaps are connected to that, but from a Western Eurasian perspective, of nomads that were to inform, in fact, and this is proven by, in fact, that kind of historiographical cultural echo in Europe, very much of our Western civilization for a reason and another. So I will surely make other videos about the Huns, maybe even soon. I don't know how you react to this, if you like the topic, if you're interested, possibly because you tend to roam around this kind of nomadic interests, except perhaps you prefer something like the Sarmatians or other, like, I don't know, the Cimmerians, the Scythians, etc. I will make videos about those as well, because I realize there is a niche there that is yet to be filled. But starting from Hunnic nomadism, right? That's in many ways a core concept. This is a people who lived at some point in Central Asia, the Caucasus, Eastern Europe, and that are documented as such as the Huns essentially between the 4th and the 6th century AD. So it's a relatively, actually they're documented also later by a certain degree, but we don't understand even there exactly from the ethnonyms, etc., whether we can, they were surely the same people, but when we talk about people here, we're talking about essentially a political identity, which seems to be historiographically and sensibly, as always in history, the most important aspect of the story. And that, however, as a power, as a cohesive people, given that, however, we don't know also what they did before and who they were exactly before, we'll talk about the Xiongnu and why the theory is discussed, but at the same time, it's, in my opinion, still valid by a certain degree, at least with the due approximations and notes, especially in warnings to understand a good theory per se. The Huns, in many ways, are overrated in that degree of power and say civilizational capacity. This is not that say anybody expected a specific civilization from them, but at the same time, the fact that they were to hegemonize essentially Central Eastern Europe, and mostly those Germanic peoples that not succeeding to escape from them in the Roman Empire kind of remained under their rule, represents something that, in fact, in European folklore and identity has gone beyond. Remember when the same Kaiser during World War I, actually even before, for those propagandistic aims said that the Germans were Huns. Back in the day where the Germans were not considered white, by the way, in places like North America or the United Kingdom. And this is part of those general, let's say, perceptions that tell us much more, not about the Huns, but ourselves and the way we look at history and we think of these legacies, right? There is, for example, here I will not digress on the topic because it's hideously, hilarious by a certain degree, but let's say the level which the Hunnic legacy is being collected, at least I'm talking, it's hilarious as far as 21st century people still at least care or pretend certain things. But I don't need to tell you how much there is a kind of Hunnic legacy collected, especially in, if you think about countries like Hungary that also have many other inspirations, and there is there also in a broader, also considering their neighbors, and think about the Balkans and the same concept of Balkanization, and so this kind of frenetic, ethnicistic core identity issues that are at the end of the day just how people want to see the past in many ways, and not really what we know about the past concretely. We're not specifically talking about the Hungarians per se, but that's the country where these things is still to be found as a sort of pan-nomadic, and in some cases also some specific ethnic, revivalism. This is the same concept of Sarmatism, right? I don't know, the Polish Szlachta beginning to believe that they were essentially descendants from the Sarmatians, and in a oligarchic, anti-monarchic sense that also made the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth shipwreck and being taken over by somebody that had kind of more in common, not much with the Sarmatians, but also, with other steppe rulers like the Mongols, to take over the same Commonwealth. And so there are, again, in the intricacy, especially of 19th and 20th century ethno-nationalistic delirium, an enormous amount of, of delusion / obsession regarding still the way we look at the Huns. And we all partake to this because of what we've made the Huns. Even this video, telling you the truth, if anything, for the pictures I use and the problems I pose, well, it's a product of that, where we're essentially reasoning on it still, right? And naturally, there is an ancestral meaning that was perceived even in fact, during the migration era regarding these people, right? And what the Romans thought of them, that entails in turn people today saying, oh no, the Romans were highly biased. Well, as if, other peoples at the time were not highly biased like the Defoe standard mode. And so there was something particularly wrong that the Romans did in considering the Huns fundamentally some monsters from the steppes that arrived from, with this kind of savage lifestyle, living on horseback, raiding, pillaging, and, having, at the end of the day, not much even of a, let's say, really else, rather this kind of initial momentum and then dying out, basically had just the way they had come, right? But the broader point is that the Huns also triggered a series of migrations, as you know, that had a domino effect on the same Roman Empire, and therefore injected within the same if not properly a Hunnic culture, but let's say a broader one of the steppes that at that point had heavily invested the same Eastern Germans, for example, that in peoples, especially like the Goths, what would be called the Ostrogoths later, and also other populations, like for example the Longobards or others that were even just living at the fringe of the so-called Hunnic Empire, the boundaries of which are also senselessly to be found. Some say that the Scandinavians were Hunnic tributaries, which is something that, yes, does fit with the general massive steppe influence that especially areas like the one of today's Sweden witness historically in their military culture and so on. And it sure reflects a pretty wide range of Hunnic interaction, also because, and believe me, every single thing about the Huns is being radically debated, right? And we will see the pattern that this criticism followed over time, which is, as we were saying before, quite exemplificative of how history is made, or how we want to make it. As they were not even just a single polity, of course, they were something else. They were a people, right, that harassed also not just the Roman Empire, right, that dealt mostly with what are called, perhaps improperly, the Black Huns. The White Huns infested mostly the Sasanian frontiers and the north, in the east, but there is a Hunnic presence that is quite strong, even up to India. Think about the Huna people, right? And this broader swarm that again fits, and we have been somewhat habituated properly to read the thing in these terms, this constant wave from the steppes, so fundamentally never ended. You can even see, in a sense, Russian Tsarism as being the last wave of this kind of steppe world in a kind of autocratic and specifically cultural terms that ended just eventually with contemporary era, with industrialization, because this thing were going on from millennia, right? And they were the norm in many ways, and much of what we think of, in fact, Western medieval values and ideas was in many ways a reinjection, especially of this new Iranian, partly Turkic wave of peoples that heavily reinforce what essentially the sedentary populations, the Western Indo-Europeans, the Germans, the Celto-Italics, etc., had somewhat remembered at a point in their ancestral origins that are all basically and exclusively founded on the equestrian culture of the steppes, and all the properly mythology or Iranian mythology of this of the horseman rising to the sky, transfiguring a god, and all these things. That was essentially our common culture. That, again, today, when I make this point, sometimes in the comments, people pop out saying, no, it's not true because the Romans and the Germans were different and such a different culture. No, we were all coming from the same freaking cauldron, and their mythology is the same, the sagas are the same, the deities are the same, the meanings are the same, even the language is the same. And differentiation later on, after it has a minimal meaning compared to the one that they believed that was their only identity, fundamentally, that we have decided to destroy through ethno-nationalism, nationalism and socialism, statalism, collectivism from the 18th, the 19th century onwards, and for which humanity should just be ashamed of existing in the first place. But in this regard, the Huns are an interesting key to explain that kind of phenomenon. So according to European tradition, that is the one that documented the Huns, or what we think the Huns were in fact better, this people was first reported living east of the Volga River, right? So in many ways, that was the boundaries of the Roman raider, as many peoples that also lived in Europe, fundamentally, we know, just historically, just because they, at a certain point, were tracked by the Greeks, by the Romans, and fortunately enough, we had that divide in kind of levels of development. The only comparable dynamic you have there is with China from the other side of Eurasia, and these peoples inhabiting the Mongolian plains, etc. But in a much different way, because China was didn't have Hellenic thought, didn't even have, say, the exact, in fact, cultural development. The same ethnographic interest, telling the truth, that especially the Romans had, and that at that point was being revived also from the first early imperial wave. So they enter the imperial raider in the Huns are spot, let's say, at the margins of the civilized world, and so that is the first place where you would think they would originate, given that those areas were being under watch and control anyway, continuously. This area was Scythia at the time, this broad area that in fact becomes also kind of an ethnographic trope, like topos in a broader sense, because the Huns were called also Scythians and beyond. This doesn't mean anything, of course, from an ethnic point of view, or it does, at least if you consider, in fact, in practice, how similar these peoples were for some aspects that also transcended the strictly ethno-linguistic one, for example. In fact, the same Huns arrival is associated in the sources with the migration westward of the Iranian Alans. I made a video about the Alans that everybody watches. It became algorithmic the first day I made it. I want to thank retrospectively also, almost 1 year after the follower that asked me, why don't you make? Oh, yeah, I did. And we discussed the Alans' Odyssey in many ways, and that's yet another. The Alans basically are the embodiment of Indo-Europeanness and utter military fulfillment culturally in an absolute sense, or at least, in relative terms at the most of any other people. But they also had their own misfortunes, starting in part with the Huns that overrun them and other peoples, and setting this chain, again, this domino effect. And the Alans were, as you know, mostly what the core knightly ideals of the Middle Ages were dramatically reinforced by the West, right? That knightly culture, again, that was sleeping in the memory of the centuries, and that was reactivated by these peoples, or the Arthurian legions, the Sarmatian auxiliaries of the Romans in Britain, the mounts, the word in the stone, this word in the stone, the word in the stone, yeah, but also the word was sacred for that matter. Knowledge was sacred, together with force and action, by the way, and reflect on those values. So the Huns were documented first on the Volga around 370 AD, and by 430 they had established, as we know, this vast, albeit short-lived dominion in Europe, essentially conquering the Goths. Crimean, their Bosphorian kingdom was fundamentally destroyed, right? We know that the Goths survived in part in Crimea up to, in the 18th century, where anthropologists being able allegedly to track still kind of what we would call modernly an Ostrogothic Greutungian trace, somatically, linguistically, etc. in the land. And in fact, those peoples do not reappear, however, if not after the collapse of the Hunnic Empire. I made several videos about the Ostrogoths, but perhaps I will make other ones. Naturally, very changed from what they had been, right? That reality in the East didn't exist anymore. These had been deeply changed peoples. They had been brutally, in fact, autocratized in many ways. I mean, the East Germans had already absorbed that kind of steppe warlord kind of mentality that they had found when migrating the Sarmatian lands in today's Ukraine, etc. Mixing naturally with these peoples, and so that original egalitarian thing, also because of the necessities of the migration that required a shift, etc., brought to some kind of more kind of verticalization of their own world. That's why the Romans had eventually had it easier in a way also to co-opt single leaders and boosting forward the same German kingship, say, at least in a practical political sense, for this main clans ruling. Think about the Amalif or the Ostrogoths, etc., so that they could be better settled, however, as sedentary peoples. Not that they could have done this, for example, with the Huns or our nomads, right? The Germans were already, let's say, Romanized even before these times by the same, obvious realization that had been living for half of a millennium next to the Roman Empire, if not properly within it, given that in terms of deterrence, that's what the Roman legions on the Rhine and the Danube really were, right? It was not just to control this side of the empire, but the other that, in fact, they considered as such. The limes is a modern invention. The Romans didn't reason like that. So the Roman borders are crucial as a concept because they represented, of course, a divide in the moment in which somebody from the other side was pushing against the same empire, also entering in an antagonistic terms with it. And the Huns basically catalyzed this process, right? Up to, as you know, at the end of the 4th century, the Romans had normally absorbed and successfully, properly defeated the various Germanic incursions through the same ways that they had always used, right? Either extermination or deportation, or, in fact, settlement, or stabilization of these peoples, also across the frontiers, often. So that's why there was that degree of Romanization, importantly. The Huns make great part of the, especially East Germanic tribe, freaking out because, of course, they didn't want to be under the Huns at all. They were normally gravitating around the Roman Empire that they hoped to essentially be integrated in one way or another. Because the fertile land was there, right? And so these mechanisms, the migration era is actually very much more complicated than it seems when one has, especially to look at the causes of why it was triggered already from the mid-2nd century AD. And so how this Hunnic movements, had they started at some point, we don't know, right? As we were saying right now, it's only from the end of the 4th century that we get the idea that the Huns were there, but from maybe they were there in just 100 years before, we don't exactly know. In any case, the divide increased at this point because, as we were saying before, the Germans had to choose of being either under the Huns or under the Romans, and there were important divides. The one, in fact, we draw between the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, but even within the same peoples. Fundamentally, there were all a set of populations like the Longobards, the Gepids, etc., that the Herulds, the Rugians, the Skir, etc., that stayed within the Hunnic orbit, right? And again, speaking of the north, that surely was the less attractive area, but say for the same Huns, probably were others too. The Franks, the Visigoths, other tribes that also fled fundamentally and didn't even have to do much with the Danubian frontier, the Rhine frontier, where the Huns were interfering with the empire, were instead within the Roman Empire. Were also some ambiguous peoples, in a sense, like the Burgundians, that at some point were in between on the middle of Rhine. They didn't know what to do. At the end of the day, Ezio took them out, deported them, and that's also probably what the Nibelungen lead. They're not actually discussing the Huns, but discussing the Romans, and the massacre of the Burgundians really describes. Now, the, the Huns, especially under King Attila, of course, made frequent and devastating raids, especially in the Eastern Roman Empire. Telling you the truth, in 451, the Huns invaded the Western Roman province of Gaul, where they fought eventually a combined army of Romans and Visigoths and other allies, including the Franks, part of the same Merovingian ancestors, etc., at a famous battle of the Catalonian plains, relatively unidentified. It's a long climatic battle of late antiquity where the Romans and their federati showed they could strike back dramatically. And in fact, the reason why the Huns were overrated is that they really were, like, this is a point that is often done, right? It's a broader Vietnam syndrome for which we have somewhat decided that any form of hit-and-run tactics is somewhat uncopable with, right? The history of Western warfare is dotted by an endless series of, in fact, Western victories against guerrilla, and also, of course, Western capacity of carrying out guerrilla that basically never ends, really. And so we have decided the terrible steppes peoples that, shot with their arrows, but then they fled. They couldn't. They puzzled the enemy. They couldn't be defeated. They were defeated. That's actually a pretty, it's an indicator, if anything, of a tactical inferiority, because if you have a strength, right, and you can use it against an enemy of which you're superior, you just attack straight, right? I realized that that politically and socially they couldn't afford, in fact, heavier troops on larger bases like the Romans or other peoples but that's the actual point, right? They were an inferior civilization. They often lacked the means to get things over with, and the Huns tried to avoid, as every time as possible, facing the Roman army in open field. The same goes for, the Persians, right? Normally, Rome was the actual civilization. The Persians were Romanized also in a military sense to pose a problem eventually, right? And even at that point, they lost anyway. So there is always evaluate what it is really a real state, right? A real orderly system, and kind of semi-privatistic feudal reality that doesn't even manage to keep things together on the long run. Can be an advantage at some point, like the Romans destroyed Persia several times, but could never occupy it at the end of the day. But that's also because the lands that were to be occupied were not worth it in the first place. So that's the cycle that begins again, but it's not a proof of, let's say, expandable strength, right? Especially considering what the final outcome really was. So Attila at that point tried for Italy in 452, but we know that he basically withdrew after having caused some havoc, especially in the northeast, but at the end of the day he didn't march to the south, also because he was being threatened by the same Eastern Roman Empire and their supply lines in the Pannonian Basin, etc. So it was probably plague or something. The Huns would have tried it again, but after the death of Attila in the year after, the Huns ceased to be anything like a major threat to Rome. Right? Consider that, again, the point of the Huns was milking the Roman cow. Right? That was the point. Destroying it would have deprived them of the possibility of receiving regular tribute, right, for stopping, preventing their own raids on the empire, which, if that had become unsustainable, also in a financial way that could be translated in arms, etc., would have brought the Romans to military expedition against the Huns, which was essentially something that the Romans didn't quite do until they entered their own territory, and also they would hope this thing would collapse in the first place. They probably knew much better than us that was the reality. Also, the Hunnic domination continued in Central and Eastern Europe for a while, until especially after the Battle of Nedau in 454, most of the Germanic subjects of the Huns managed to break free from this domination. That, however, again continued, right? Especially some peoples like the Longobards, etc., seemingly remained on a longer, for a longer period of time, also under Attila's successors, etc., because it was convenient for some of them to have this overlords be part of their circuit, etc., even if they were still decentralized and if within the same peoples there were important debates regarding, especially the Huns boosted the Germanic elites, right, aristocracy, as you were saying before. They made various clan leaders rising over the people. That's the reason why most of the Germanic peoples that were under the Huns, not all of them, paradoxically, not even the Longobards, and probably because they were more decentralized, had a much greater divide between the elites and the people, right? It's rare to find among the previous Germanic subjects like a society where freemen were really a tough, strong, middle class power, right? They were already being hegemonized by some oligarchs, and they went mostly like that also through the further Romanization, the settlement in Roman territory later on. So descendants of the Huns, or successors with similar names, by the way, because seemingly the term Hun was sort of political meaning to indicate the rulers or at least that may have been connected to an original ethnicity, but were to be thought in that sense as those who had made it in the steppe, and so they had acquired, like Rome, right? The Romanity acquired a universal meaning eventually for all empires in Europe ever since, and couldn't be done without, even by the Germans. But the Huns, evidently, were on other standards, the steppes ones, and so they left a trace among mostly those peoples, mostly southeast, especially also west in some cases, but having occupied parts of Eastern Europe and Central Asia in between the 4th and the 6th century. It was seemingly the heyday of their power in the first place. And variants of the Hun name are recorded in the Caucasus until the early 8th century, right away, as the area was also a bit more sheltered compared to the open plains of the north and the empires of the south through this kind of political upheavals. And so some peoples, including even the Alans, we were talking about this in the aforementioned video, really dwelled still as a modest power, but still relatively isolated from the rest in the Caucasian foothills, let's say. The Hunnic ethnic origins are still relatively a mystery, or better, they can't quite be demonstrated factually. In the 18th century, the French scholar Joseph de Guigne became the first to propose a link between the Huns and the Xiongnu people, the latter living in northern China from the 3rd century BC to the late 1st century AD, when they were crushed by the Huns. Seemingly the northwest Huns may be connected to this westward migration to find a new life, new abodes in a critical moment, given they were at least the ones inhabiting the wilder areas of the Xiongnu in the first place. And naturally, the 18th century was not like the top of historiographical punctuality, let's say, but Guigne theory, ever since, in spite of deep criticism, has not been really debunked per se, right? Meaning, probably, yes, there is a link between the Huns and the Xeon. This problem illustrates, generally speaking, how we go by with history today. That is, we pretend that until something is factually not demonstrated, it doesn't exist in the first place, right? So this is insanity, because of course there are lots of things that you can't demonstrate, but they're there, right? You can't describe, you can observe, links, etc. Of course, when it comes to peoples, ethnicities, origins in places that are radically underdocumented and you don't know what the hell, the Huns even spoke, or what they venerated, or in fact, what was their previous history between, say, even connecting them to the Xeon between the first century, late first century AD to the late 4th century. Well, it's all very complicated, and we give you that. I personally, I did study the migration here at some point in my life in some degree of accuracy, let's put it in this way, and the judgment that I have matured, generally speaking, on the revolving around these problems is that when we talk about single specific peoples, and we can fundamentally trace some of their origins at some point through legends and tradition and mythology, etc., we should always be aware of the fact that there is a connection between those, right? That there is hardly something like a completely invented story, right? This is not just saying, conspiracy theory, like, but why didn't, we have no evidence, but, that guy said that half comma, and therefore it's possible, that the aliens came, Well, that's not really how I mean. It's like, for example, studying Gothic history or one of other people's. At some point, it's normal for those peoples not to have left any significant evidence of their origins, right? Names per se do not mean anything, because they could have easily acquired them culturally for somebody else, especially in this more hierarchicized peoples that were somewhat more, the elites of whom were more international in many ways. The process of ethnogenesis definitely makes us to think that, that the majority of these peoples were just other people that began to follow them, right? And the main problem that we have in accepting this original, let's say the originality of the core of these peoples, is that we're obsessed about the, again, ethno-nationalistic meaning that we attach to these things, right? There are people that, I don't know, think that the gods were, the typical Swedes just, arriving in, Italy or Spain, and, there is, Jordanus said that, without even any form of historiographical, literary, philological expertise, and pretending that to be the case, right? I am one of those people that says, yes, the Traditionskern surely, I believe, let's say, not surely, but quite likely came from Scandinavia. Then, of course, this mass of other peoples gravitating around this core, being integrated, coming to join and to follow them. Sometimes we're also different peoples. When there were Turks, we know that. They did not become kind of that ethnic group, but there were also still within the ethnic group lots of other peoples like that. Surely built a great part of the populations, and we just don't know the numbers. The case, now I chose the example of the Goths because they are very connected to the Huns, as you know. It seems that together with Hunnic, Gothic was somewhat a lingua franca within the Hunnic Empire, that the Huns had a great reputation of the Goths, that in turn, as we've seen, were fundamentally Sarmato-Germanic people rather than anything. If we were to talk about other populations, like, I don't know, the aforementioned Longobards, that is studied a bit more, those, for example, there is surely, if you look at, I don't know, the first, like the graves of Pannonia or Italy in the first generation of the settlement, those are, Steppenvölker. There is no doubt. Those are people that you can hardly distinguish in material culture from the Huns, for example. But when you look at the route, for example, that the Longobards followed, they just descended from the Elbe, like from Scandinavia, and they're probably but across the Elbe and then in Moravia and Pannonia and then to Italy. You even wonder, doesn't matter how these peoples might have been mixed with others or culturally influenced, etc. But how many, like properly from a demographic point of view, also considering the scarce density of population of this time, how much they would have been affected, right, by like ethnically by other peoples in a strictly, I don't know, properly genetic way. That's more debatable. Right? For the Ostrogoths, instead, we have much greater issues because great part of their story is being fabricated by the Romans in the 6th century for the same Goths who asked for that, because they didn't have a presentable set, nor a common set there of actual common histories that, at least even if they existed, were to be engineered so to make them see it as a history of dynasty, a history of nobility, that for the Goths migrating, like what the difference was with the Longobards, for example, instead had a people's myth, right? It is diametrically opposed. And it's obviously the consequence of Hunnicization, of Romanization, that the Longobards underwent relatively as a compact ethnic group. So the same thing can be said on a larger scale for the Huns, right? If these peoples, as we will see now, had migrated from even, we don't think just Turkic areas in Central Asia, but even Eastern Asian, Mongolic background, well, they had to cross the entire freaking Eurasia to get in Europe. And in fact, what genetic finds suggest, albeit those are also very scanty, and we will never be able to actually reconstruct significantly from a statistical point of view what the entire people was like, because at best we find nobiliar tombs that are also pretty, for the same aforementioned reason, the noblemen they were the most ethnically mixed because they married on a much larger scale, and just the evidence is very scarce. There are some hundreds, I think just a couple of hundreds of tombs that can be connected with the Huns, and the evidence can be provided by them is extremely scarce. I think that the Huns were to be counted in the tens of thousands, and even there, who were the Huns? Were those just coming from Central Asia, or were they, do we count all the Iranians, the Turks, the Germans that were within them as well? That's, again, very complicated. In fact, the most sound assessment we can make is that the Huns that we look at in European history were essentially a hybrid between Western Eurasian and kind of Turkic Mongolian, Mongolic people, right? And that's the evidence, even just, that does match. There are enormous problems, of course, also with when do you want to confront that, because we don't have the same amount of documentation, even genetically speaking, for, I don't know, people that lived in Mongolia and China at the time. Like, it's extremely complicated. But generally speaking, yeah, that's more or less what we think it could have been. There were lots of populations that joined them along the way, and that simply were subjugated by them, or didn't have much of another choice. In fact, the Germans are a good example. We know practically nothing about Hunnic culture because of the aforementioned scarcity of archaeological remains, and also because they were nomads, right? Had they been sedentary, we would have had a much more concrete idea of them, right? It's difficult for us to understand that for the Germans. You can imagine for the Huns that were somewhat truly nomadic, at least, there are some standards there, but they were mostly just pastoral peoples, while the Germans were de facto agriculturers, even though, of course, they were, especially during the migration era, importantly affected by pastoralism. They were often on the move, but their movements were kind of also often more gradual, right? The steppes peoples had a much greater cohesion, at least temporarily, so that they could move just like a projectile through the whole freaking system of the steppes without kind of losing at least that Traditionskern, but also essentially when they lost momentum, they wouldn't have much else keeping them together. This is typical of the steppes, all right? Whereas for the cemeteries, it's different. They're much looser systems in a sense, but they're also they also have a greater traditional continuity. We know that the Huns used bronze cauldrons, for example. They performed artificial cranial deformation, which also some, for example, Germanic subjects, in order to imitate those elites by whom they were coopted, carried out as well. There is no description, for example, of Hunnic religion at the time of Attila. There are some hints, and we will look at them now, but divination is attested, shamanism, perfectly normal for Eurasian steppe people. The Huns did have a language on their own, but we have just a bunch of words of personal names attesting it, and so they're complicated by the fact that we think that some of these names were also they're very difficult to trace etymologically. Some people look at the Mongol root word, the Turkic root word, the Germanic root word. Some of them were mixed, by the way, in the process. So it's difficult really to understand what happened. Of course, within the Huns, the various clans had different backgrounds, and especially after they settled in Europe, there was an important influence also from the local elites. Think about the Goths. So you find even some Germanic hybrids with the Hunnic names. That tells you by how blended, in a sense, that these peoples were at that point. Economically, we know they were nomadic shepherds. They, of course, changed a bit their ways when they arrived in Europe, and they were increasingly tied with Rome through tribute, raiding, and trade. Right, the extent which this would happen is debated. Right, it doesn't seem, for example, there to be a dramatically intense strait, but surely the Huns controlled important choke points like in the Strait of Kerch, other areas that had to do with the Silk Road, likely the Sogdian financiary connection, and that's the Huns exploited, right, taxed and drew revenues from. So that was their main point, right, to have a control over those markets as well. We don't think the Huns had a unified government. They surely had something going on in terms of hierarchization, especially under Attila, whose success would bring the possibility of accumulating more surplus and capitalizing on it. There were some kind of tribal state, mostly connected to that kind of hoarding system. It was aimed eventually at redistributing it among the subjects to wage in a coordinated way raids against Rome and getting more tribute in the process. But they were not a unitary people, really, and even if it was a general overlord, at some point this could be overthrown, as it happened basically with all the ones that we know, and thus bringing to some sort of egalitarian joint rule of the oligarchs, or at least something very loosely representable as such. The Huns were also militarily speaking the typically steppes, kind of mounted archery-based army, right? With a few armored troops of the nobiliar elite, and the swarms of lighter cavalrymen from the tributary peoples. Albeit when again they settled in Europe, they surely relied on different troops, such as the one of the Germanic tribes that included significant amount of infantry and so on. But cavalry does seem to have remained central in their warfare, and this is what we were talking about before, relatively to peoples that also began in Central Europe, began to live the Hunnic ways, and actually, even if they weren't particularly affected by them genetically, they essentially transformed themselves into raiders, participating into that kind of activity. But for the rest, we don't see, even in this, much of a radical change of local European warfare that hadn't already been, or some, say, important, mostly increasing cavalry forces and mounted archery. But through a dynamic that was already going on in the previous centuries in the same regions occupied by the Huns. So surely the Huns stimulated the Great Migration. Right? So indirectly they were one of the major factors contributing to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, that still could have easily survived in spite of the Huns or even of any other people there up to the 60s of the 5th century. There is a lot of trace in European folklore of that time that becomes, especially in the Germanic heroic legion, a bit the golden age of this kind of heroic deeds. And as we were saying before, the Nibelungenlied takes place, as you know, in Germany on the Rhine, but also in Vienna on the Danube, at the court of Attila, which probably might have been another one, maybe actually a Roman one of Etzius, etc. So that comes from the High Middle Ages, eventually in written form. So it's all kind of a different story, really. But that tells you, in fact, how much the Huns had stuck in the Germanic memory, in Germanic past. This was surely also a moment of great Germanic involvement in the Hunnic raids and military exploits. So great part of that sense, again, of oligarchy, of monarchy even, that would define most Germanic peoples later on, was triggered by the Huns, right? So eventually comforted by the Romans as well, but to control the Germanic peoples better through these single chiefs. But it was at the same time actually a dramatic moment. And in fact, the same bath of blood of the Nibelungenlied is one of, again, the goriest, more dramatic ones you can imagine. So the trauma there is quite deeply rooted, and this surely was like a big deal for all the populations inhabiting Central and Eastern Europe at the time, and the entire Visigothic migration in Thrace, the Battle of Adrianople. This was all triggered by the fear, by the terror spreading of this population that you cannot stop. Like you see here, not just there weren't tanks, planes, helicopters, and an enemy approached, you had to go confront them face to face. But literally, if a people was more compact than yours and they were just habituated to that degree of punching capacity, that the metus hostilis of the steppes was definitely a very bad place to live, and a traumatic place to be ethnogenetically born. You didn't have much chances, right? The Germanic peoples, for example, were something else. They had a much larger sedentary population. They literally had to leave And that was a trauma for, again, largely agricultural people that had to just abandon their land or ending up subjugated by the population. So we're not talking about all the upheaval that, as we were saying before, this domination entailed politically, essentially the rise of the elites, the impoverishment of the middle classes, and so on. So it was really a pretty shattering experience. You know that there are traces, for example, the Szekely ethnic group in Hungary is said to be descended from the Huns. Also, this thing is being debated, but there is some genetic connection has been demonstrated, so some similarity at least, and it's possible that this was the case. Again, how peoples change identity and culturally, ethnically, etc., can happen quite quickly from a historical point of view, right? That's why you have, I don't know, white Cossacks or Tartars, or why even contemporary people are not habituated to reason in those terms anymore. Times passes, right? And changes very often are very rapid in areas that you can't even document for not even knowing that they happen at some point, proving that. So that's why it makes it complicated. But at the same time, a greater connection between certain groups can be defined because ideas do permeate, but there are not just mechanic dynamics in politics and society. There is also a point in why such changes are made and why they are to be maintained and perceived. I mean, the idea of the Huns as extremely cruel and barbaric that we have maintained, it was something that we embraced enthusiastically as Europeans. As the same example before, the Germans identifying with Huns, being identified as terrible, cruel, and barbaric Huns by their enemies as well. That is what they wanted during World War I, before, because those values that today we have changed, because today we're concerned with other ideas, do not still, however, render justice to the broader meanings that remain for a much longer time in history, and that were functional to a world that we don't understand anymore. I mean, being cruel and barbaric, again, by 19th century Europeans, Central Europeans, like that previous example, was like, yeah, it was okay. They were okay with that. They wanted to stress that. Because after all, yes, the world was wilder. There was more brutal, especially certain areas, right? That today we stress as, say, there is, for example, an important divide between Western and Central Europe, people, as well as between Central and Eastern Europe, that people do not seem to consider much anymore. Because today what matters is the North and the South, ideally, because it's not even true at a, for example, socioeconomical level. That's the other thing that you want to stress. But being cruel and spreading terror, for example, is one of the single most politically and strategically effective measures. For example, among a people in the steppe, or one that wants to assert some kind of domination over another, right? Very often these means fail, as also the example of World War I proves, with that kind of Hunnic ideology. But they do, exactly because they are connected with a different civilizational level. And the Huns in this regard represented, I would say, in European folklore, kind of, in fact, a revival of values that in some areas either never died or were functional to certain specific political agendas. For somebody to collect the Hunnic legacy and say, okay, we are the Hun, right? For example, what's the value in Hungary to having the the base, like developing, for example, for medieval chronicles, that the Hungarians, even that were identified with the Huns altogether, were to be considered as such. Or what about also, I found, I don't know, some Turkish people that want to convince everyone and everything that breathes is Turkish, and they go to Hungary maybe and they start discussing the fact that the Huns were Turks, so the Hungarians are Huns, so the Hungarians are Turks, and this kind of obsession. So even if modern Turkish people basically have almost nothing to do with ethnic Turkic populations of Central Asia, but still that's the point, right? And you should pose yourself some question why these things still go on, which have hardly anything to do with the past, but still tell you, even at the time, what various peoples really preferred as a way of rule, what kind of model they wanted to portray themselves through. And it's obvious that for a steppe population or a semi-nomadic people that is basing its power on terror, because it doesn't have the civilizational tools to centralize or to rule an empire like the Roman one, etc. Being a bloodthirsty maniac does sound as pretty effective in a way. It's the same thing that the Mongols did in the first wave of invasions. They were objectively barbaric and primitive. They exterminated everyone. They destroyed some of the largest and most beautiful and more advanced areas. Think about Merv, that was the single most populated city in the world before the Mongols destroyed it. Most people don't even know where it is. Or Baghdad. It's as if, for Islam, it's as if, comparatively, somebody erased to the ground Rome for Christianity. The Muslims arguably never recovered from that shock, right, from that trauma. The Crusades, in comparison, did not exist comparably, right? So it's one of those things that, and then the Mongols kind of were civilized and gentrified, and stopped doing that also because they had to start ruling from the same places that they had initially terrorized just to temporarily maintain under control, effectively, by the way. But it doesn't last forever. The Mongol Empire vanished, right? And so the Hunnic Empire lasted for, 20 years? You understand that even though in the rest, again, of the Eurasian steppes, this thing went on by some degree, but not as a single polity, right? So I'm tempted to actually stop it here because this thing is long enough. Let's put it in this way. And just some thoughts about the topic in general, and maybe I could add. Yeah, let's stop it here, like a broader reflection. But let's try to see what's the point, right? This is not just about reasoning. As if we were to verify something that occurred in the past, but realizing why what is being said up to this day about the past was said in a way rather than another, right? And unfortunately, I will not say there is a topic perhaps that is interesting regarding to this, and I promised you I would talk about today. That is how the original 18th century connection between the Huns and the Xiongnu has been treated, right? So fundamentally, in the surprise, in the mid-20th century, somebody began, and also in later times, contestation times, etc., came out and saying, no, this is not true, because you cannot identify any people. It doesn't make any sense to claim whether the Huns were Turkic, Mongolian, Iranian, whatever. It can't be said or done because there is no proof. The question again is, why shouldn't there be any proof? We have some evidence to reason through, right? And while it is true that we cannot verify that, and it's always pretty much of an issue, and obviously that same evidence tells us that they were blended. Still, the political meaning of that Hunnic core, say, had sprung from somewhere, right? We find also some genetic evidence that is compatible with East Asian elements, where you could say, well, they're not, they might have ended there simply because Eurasia and the steppes belt, let's say, was always crossed, longitudinally by these peoples for thousands of kilometers. But still, there was somebody in the middle, right? So the attitude of saying, well, we cannot know, it's useless to ask, let's say, is, in my opinion, wrong, right? It's more correct to say, what difference does it make, which surely is a much more interesting and intelligent question, in my opinion. That is to say, why would we care, right? At the end of the day, how and why would you care? Because what do we make history for at the end of the day? What's the difference, let's say, in the way we think of the Huns if we discovered that they were kind of more prevalently East Asian than Turkic, or even there was this dramatic, in fact, Iranian element within them by a certain degree? Well, it would surely help understanding better. But the type of history is that we have, the type of evidence, and I say the type of history, specifically the type of historiography, that is what wanted other people to make us know about the Huns, that makes what we need, in a way. And the point being that what, for example, the Romans describe the Huns like dark-skinned or flat-nosed or with a shapeless head and like little monsters that lived glued to their ugly horses, because this is literally what they were, actually mean for us. Because, you see, in a world where people have even lost cognition of what, for example, Roman history or culture is, or maybe has not even really understood it ever yet, or at least at a large scale, like a popular level, how is that information, for example, going to affect you? If somebody comes out saying, well, there were a bit of Iranians in there were a bit of Germans in there were a bit of Turks in there, a bit of Mongols there, really, right? We will never find the actual numbers, the actual proportions. It's over. There is no way of doing that. Even if we were to find a special technology at some point that would make us discover more graves and analyzing more effectively, the DNA test, most of that world is destroyed, right? It's disintegrated, materially, physically, organically, doesn't exist anymore. So really what we have living in the spirit is that history, is that account telling that the Huns were strange peoples that lived, some say, without a god, which is not correct, but still, what did it mean for a sedentary civilization of imperial universal value to say these peoples live without a god, or that they descended from kind of demons in a way, and also Gothic witches, for example, which from an Uranian Apollonian standpoint, like the one of the Indo-European tradition, or at least maybe it was the same thing that the Huns believed in, conversely, really meant from Roman sources, for example. The idea of Gothic witches, the idea of that is true, that is permanent, that is alive also in the Germano-Norse mythology, of the incumbent dark, chthonic, demonic aspect, dimension of the world, opposed and constantly threatening the Uranian Apollonian hero that is archetypically symbolized by the woman, but by the witch, right? The dark woman, the chthonic woman, not the splendid princes, the remain of those pre-Indo-European populations that were connected to the canonicals of the earth, etc. It's like a bit like Europeans. I made a video about the Mongols through the eyes of Europeans in the 13th century. We thought the Mongols to come from the Gog and Magog, being these monstrous entities at the end of the world that God had sent as dark forces to revive the spirit of heaven in the fallen Christians. That has a specific meaning, and it speaks mostly of that. It speaks mostly of what, in parallel, the Huns would have believed. There is this problem today that I see often on YouTube, too, because in many ways I don't really look at other, I mostly read academic works, and I don't go around the internet kind of for any other purpose than accidentally looking at suggesting videos, not even clicking on them. But this obsession that reads the idea that I really can't understand for anyone that has any historical culture, that sources are biased. Of course sources are biased. Why? Are you not personally biased? Do you know anyone that is unbiased? Right? And what does that mean? It means that, if somebody's biased, whatever they say has no meaning or value or correctness. Some biased sources are the best, most objective, more accurate, more intelligent, and insightful ones. Okay, let's study, this historical event from the perspective of this people, because, somebody else was biased and made us think otherwise. Well, there is always a reciprocity, right? You cannot understand the Huns, but through the Romans, for example, not because the Romans are, I don't know about you, but I prefer civilization, right? People who read and write and have states and permanent armies and discipline and hierarchical complex system called then, barbarians from the steppes that actually were, because these people lived, and we know how they lived concretely from the poor archaeological remains. That's quite evident. It's just like what we were saying about the Mongols before, right? You cannot appreciate a people just because at some point they peaked in power, but eventually a few hundred years later was no trace of them. And other peoples that already pre-existed them kind of remained throughout their millenary civilization. And we don't know Mongolia today, but essentially for Genghis Khan, right? The Huns were anxious of, confronting themselves with the rest of the world, because they knew they had limits, right? They were not coming with the actual idea of being able to make it against bigger civilizations. They hadn't made it before. That was perhaps also the reasons why they were coming west, and they met, again, surprise, surprise, a more advanced civilization, and they lasted for 20 years, essentially raiding it and then disappearing. How is, this not actually conforming to the idea that the Romans left ourselves of the same Huns, right? And I could go on, because as I was saying before, it's not that, say, the Huns remained. We know that, right? Throughout, we made lots of videos about the 6th century Byzantine army, and we looked at, how many Turks and Huns, etc. existed normally as mercenaries around. We know the Huns surely mixed with other peoples, some ethnonyms remained, etc. But let's say that pushing force, that gluing capacity, that political force, that moral capacity of leading these people towards the conquest of the world, at the end of the day, crashed miserably against peoples that objectively didn't have much to learn from the Huns, right? The Huns may have stunned the Romans because, they were, much more functionalized with their ponies, their specific horse breeds, to have a greater strategic mobility. They brought more intensely the composite bow and the scene in that kind of coordinated, more like probably hardcore steppe dimension that by a certain degree perhaps had not been mastered in the West in Western Eurasia, not even by the Sarmatians, that were already in their heaviness kind of more towards the direction of sedentarization. Was it the just the fact that they did appear in a world like those times that we don't consider in modern, but through modern secular lenses, like some god's punishment, some sort of anomaly that had to be understood, right? It's true that there were, for example, the same Huns were associated to the Scythians, to other peoples that in many ways were also similar, right, in lifestyle, etc. But again, there was a reason, right, in the broader hierarchy of reason why these peoples were perceived as less, right? It's the barbarian surely existed as a concept within the Huns. It existed within the Germans, right? They wouldn't call it that way. We would call it in another way, but the concept was exactly the same. There is a lesser people that are more psychophysically degenerate than us, that essentially deteriorated much more from the race of gods that are meant to rule the world and from which our elites descend biologically from, and they are just more stupid, less advanced. They're more brutal, more violent, but the heroes are more intelligent, more capable. It's the same idea that the Romans had towards other peoples, that the Germans had towards other people. So when kids today are obsessed because they just want to create an echo chamber where they can just be obsessed with their own identitarism, because basically they can't go beyond any other sense of individual merit and self-accomplishment, and they're told they're hyper-sheltered, and they're told that fundamentally if something goes wrong, it's not their fault, they're good people, that there is no such thing like evil, that's what they're doing, what they're living for, even though they're completely unbred, raised in terrible families without any discipline or culture. They're basically uneducated, like just rising like Hunnic mares, like grazing in the fields, or just in hoping that it would become mature human. I mean, it's obvious that history doesn't become anymore a matter of being able to objectivize these hierarchical systems, and through that lens reading who the Huns were, not to demonize them but to appreciate them, actually what they achieved for their own means, but also being able to assess them and evaluating them for what they were. The Huns didn't leave a trace so harsh, like for example the Avars or the Magyars. Not even the Mongols, telling the truth, right? The Huns for the West have been crucial also because they've always been associated with the fall of the Roman Empire in a sense, and that's the actual reason. And if you understand that, you understand also how obsessive that specific moment in history has become, right? It's become central for reasons connected to that, the aforementioned modernization and secularization. So in order to justify the fact that a universal empire dies and that you would like to be in the next one, you have to dramatize how empires fall, and so transform all these eras as sort of kind of obscure degeneration, and not as a very complex and meaningful dynamic that can also help you understanding why things alongside the pattern, for example, of universal tradition, gradually degraded in much creepier and subtle form than the Huns, than a people arriving and again not accomplishing a good match, right? In a broader perspective. So my videos may be confusing in some way. They may also be provocative and unnecessary by a certain degree, but I don't know what you're really here for, like, what can help you concretely to approach this time better. Today, I tell the truth, I didn't sleep much. So I was extremely tired. I didn't know what video to make. I decided to talk about the Huns, but because I had in store another video, but I said, I have more time tomorrow. Instead, I didn't sleep at all. And so I decided to just roam freely around the Huns. And we can maybe, I don't know, tomorrow we can talk about them more and more in detail. But I thought that this general premise, right, for the eventual videos that we will make about the Huns, hopefully, that there is actually plenty of things to tell, because they are an important chapter of Eurasian history, and surely they had their glory. They had their moment of height. They had the moment in which they thought they could achieve the unachievable. Right, so before I said, yes, the Huns didn't accomplish, but yeah, in perspective, yes, there are much more, there were much more successful people in insight and in other ways, but the Huns themselves helped that world being modeled, right, and they managed to strike and puzzled the Romans that had to cope with them seriously at a point by realizing that, of course, an empire is not held if you are going to give ground to peoples like this, and having to manage, in fact, also the main problem, arguably, that was posed by, in fact, the migration that the Huns had triggered of the Germanic elements and so on, in quite a already critical moment of Roman history for various reasons, and that's what that push, not just 378 but also 406, exemplify that kind of sense, like what the Romans were witnessing is the collapse of their frontiers. They couldn't quite control anymore, and that was much of a problem of other peoples than the Huns per se. And the Huns also stimulated a Germanic, Romano-Germanic cooperation that remained at the root in some regions, especially in Gaul. Also to build an important precedent of which to trust, each other, to essentially facilitate also the passage from Roman to Germanic domination at some points, even though, as we were talking about it just recently, was just mostly the Romans deciding what leadership to accept. And so the Romans, and the Huns in this, but the Germans, etc. I made a video also specifically about them, right, explaining especially how much the Huns were distant, in a sense, from both the Germans and the Romans than the latter were to each other, because, as a matter of fact, there was surely a cohesive capacity eventually, even in the rebellion of the same Germans against the Hunnic yoke, that eventually brought most of these peoples to become Roman federati at the end, in facilitating the process of Roman-German blending, especially in the West, and quite successfully so. I mean, think about the Ostrogoths in Italy, but also the impact that Hunnic culture did have in among the Western Germans. Right, the Tomb of Chilperic shows Roman and Germanic, but not strictly Germanic, rather quite Hunnic dominated Germanic customs. So the Huns had become at that point, maybe it's too far-fetched as an idea, but let's say as a radical point of reference, right? Also a civilizationally endangering one, to make other peoples taking over the Roman Empire, but without accepting the full formula of the Romans. That is quite evident also in the Goths, that had lots of problems, for example, in abandoning Arianism, whereas the Franks, that had been former, Roman federati from a while, they understood earlier, at least thanks to Clovis, that the full Catholicization was the best way to take over, like to hegemonize actually Romano-Germanic Europe, and making both traditions actually live together successfully. So, and that's, as I made a video also recently, was a dramatic success for the Merovingians and for Western civilization altogether. So yes, the Huns came to represent a resistance to certain ideas that, however, were to take over, and that is, in my opinion, one of the single most macroscopic civilizational indicators. If those ideas, those resisting ideas, were kind of from a nomadic people from the steppes, well, you realize that maybe there was something relatively wrong about that concept, right? And the fact that it didn't win in the end, because still the side of Romano-Catholicism prevailed, together with all the Roman legacy and essentially also identity and continuity. It's paradox. We're making that video just so closely about how the Romans chose to be Germans, and how I should make another one, already made actually, that it's titled From the Regnum Francorum to the Imperium Romanum Christianum, how the Germans chose to be Romans again in the Holy Roman Empire. And that's in my opinion one of the single most important events in the history of mankind, but those macroscopic events like pillars also of the same Western identity. And what is interesting too about this all is that if you look at Central Eastern Europe in general, or at least parts of it, the migration era didn't end, right? Basically, in the West, the last great migration was the Longobard one. It was also the largest, telling the truth, and it was there. Basically, there were some groups of Bulgars that, anecdotally, the same Longobards would settle in central Italy by the 7th century, but it was a very different thing. But let's say if you look at the history again, immediately east of this, so the Balkan Peninsula, the Pannonian Basin, etc., Eastern Europe, you realize that the migration era and those peoples and those models that were countered equally when civilization began to develop gradually in the High Middle Ages too, but even before, against them, they had always had to cope with these waves of peoples from the steppe. You realize that that struggle never quite ended. The example I was doing before, up to the recent times, in a sense, is still alive. I'm truly convinced of this, that it's become civilizations versus civilization, right? You can argue that you can't, say, blame a people for being just underdeveloped per se, but the problem, it's not much that. The problem is the reasons why it didn't happen, or at least what are you doing with that. If you have a positive attitude towards improvement, that's a win for everyone involved, right? If the attitude is destructive and or it doesn't actually at least bring anywhere positive on the long run, it doesn't convince and it loses, right? So this topic is important because today it seems to me that we prefer still somewhat the bad barbarians to, even if it were the bad civilized people, and that's pretty weird, honestly. I mean, you understand that only when you understand what those are, the bad civilized people. That is, there is no martyr commoner people that are brave and pure and tyrannized. It's most of the case the contrary, that the average doesn't quite understand the meaning of civilization anymore because it doesn't have to fight for it anymore, and refuses to, and therefore lacks also the training, the teaching, the doctrine of struggle and victory, that instead it's at the root of civilization. So especially in moments of crisis or decline, or it is perceived so, you can always make things crack more easily than it seems, but at the same time, that's where civilization, when tested, really responds when it's won, right? So maybe this digression is unnecessary, but I think that it's an interesting point for a general interpretation of history. And I say it at the end of the day, maybe some of you will have stopped listening to this video because you think that I'm too, have too much conservative vibes into this. But let's say I have a great admiration for the Huns, right? In a general sense, right? I don't approach history by saying, oh, look at that people, that is developed, that is underdeveloped. I just understand that, you know why? Because I know that today we can't really afford to do it towards those people. Those people had their own logic, their own point, their own capacity, their own flaws, their own problems, their own faults in many ways. But at the same time, they made the thing happen. I mean, those 20 years, the Huns had it, right? And they were able to do a lot of interesting things. And so the way they did it with their background and what they had gone through is remarkable indeed. So I always have a great historical respect, even, let's say, not much for maybe the decision of, or few of many, but the way things are, the way people are able to make things happen by a certain degree, which is not to be taken lightly, because that's where civilization is able to substantiate itself. It is action per se. All right, we will talk about the Huns hopefully soon. However, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.